There is simply no way that over 1 million people have become too sick to work in the last 5 years of working age. My great caution to everyone in Britain in 2025 would be we shouldn't just assume that we are a wealthy country as of right. We have to actually do the things that make it possible to succeed. Fundamentally, the next Conservative government is going to have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum, Director of Communications here, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Sir Simon Clarke. Simon was a government minister, both in the Treasury as Exchequer Secretary and then Chief Secretary, and then we worked together indeed at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, as it was then known. Simon is now a fellow think tanker at Onward and chair of Conservative YIMBY. Simon, welcome.
Thank you very much, Cal. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, look, there's loads to get into. We've already been talking about off camera, but I'd like to start on the housing topic, and then we'll go more broad. Because you were Housing Secretary indeed, and our chair of Conservative YIMBY, and Onward also does a lot of housing work, and as we do here at the IEA. So, with your Conservative YIMBY hat on, first of all, how do you see the solutions to the housing problem in the broader sense, but also how are those solutions overcome within the Conservative Party that has had a mixed record on delivery on this front?
Yeah, well, you put your finger on it there with the mixed record, right? The challenge is therefore twofold. It's first of all to develop the right policy solutions to actually show how we can achieve a step change in supply, because this is fundamentally a supply side problem, but also how we can win the argument that actually doing this is necessary, right, and will benefit not just the country that we serve, but also the Conservative Party specifically, because that has become a real mental block, I think, for a lot of Conservative MPs, a lot of Conservative councillors. And unless we can reclaim our traditional position as the party of home ownership, I think it puts us in a very difficult position. And unless the country can get back to building more homes, I think it puts all of us in a real bind whereby real growth is suppressed, but also the life chances of generations, and it is now multiple generations, are really irretrievably damaged. So there is an enormous amount to do. The government is doing some of it, in terms of its attempts to liberalise land supply and planning, is not doing anywhere near enough to develop the pace of building that we need.
So give us some examples. We're not going to solve the entire problem right yet, but some sort of talismanic examples of what the government should be doing more to solve this.
Well, the Centre for Cities estimate that we're somewhere between 4 and 5 million houses short, and that's the figure you need to have in mind when you consider the government's own 1.5 million homes target over the course of this parliament. It's really clear now that they're not going to hit that. In fact, they're not going to hit that by some margin. They probably won't even get to 1 million homes on the current build rates. And so you're going to have to go harder at the practical obstacles to the delivery of housing. And that's what makes their recent climb down as a government on the ambition of their planning reform really disappointing. Instead, what they ought to be doing is going harder at the things like the habitats regulations, the EU legacy regulations, which privilege every possible environmental obstacle to building over the right, not just of the industry to build, but of government to override those authorities like Natural England who have the ultimate say on where the development can go ahead. So it's sort of a double lock. It's not just the house building industry whose hands are tied. It's actually ministers themselves. And that is the extraordinary extent to which government has surrendered the initiative in this space. We also need to do a lot more when it comes to the underlying economics of house building as well. So the supply chains are in a bad state. The training pipelines aren't what they ought to be. There is probably also, in the medium term, a gap in demand side support as well. So the government has withdrawn Help to Buy. I think they ought to be looking at some kind of programme to make sure that until such time as supply side reform can start to deliver the goods, and it will if you give it the chance, you bridge that period with some kind of actual support for aspirant home buyers, because at the moment the market is gummed up. it is that category of people in the sort of 25 to 40 age range who are just not able, particularly in London and the Greater South East, to come forward. And I think a scheme targeted at those people who actually need help would be very timely.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the supply side reform, there's going to be, that you've mentioned already, there's going to be some quite radical things that need to happen there. So the ability of government to not be have their hands tied, for example. But those are politically difficult, aren't they? And so how? And so we've already seen. So I was initially buoyed by the fact that the government had lots of good language about taking on the blockers, etc. But have succumbed a little bit to some of those already. How does the Conservative Party, which has historically had more of a problem with in that political space, say that actually they are willing to be radical enough?
Well, I think we're going to have to win this argument on two levels. The first is to say we should concentrate building where it is most needed. And I think that's an easy argument to win, or an easier argument to win. So we should be looking to densify in our towns and cities. The political challenge is lower and the economic gain is higher. And so, I am an unashamed believer in densifying, particularly London, but all the main cities where demand is really very high and supply is woefully short, and the mismatch between London and what's required in London is the greatest of anywhere. So let's definitely satisfy the challenge that you're not just displacing demand into green spaces without even trying in the brownfield sites. But then there is a second challenge, which is to say that brownfield first cannot become brownfield only, because, that is one of the great shibboleths which I'm afraid too many Conservatives have clung to. It isn't true. We are not, I'm afraid, able to match the size of the problem we have by just doing building in cities. We ought to be therefore looking at how we find a fair way of building in sites in the countryside which are sensible, and you've got to be looking here at which sites will have maximum strategic value to unlock, how you can protect sites of genuine beauty and civic amenity in the countryside, and in particular within the green belt, but also how you can adopt a much more realistic appraisal of, for example, golf courses, low value agricultural land, in a way which is simply not happening at the moment. There are too many people who are clinging to the idea that defending every, bit of scrub in the vicinity of London is a sort of political goal in its own right. And for as long as you do that, you are privileging, I'm afraid, the haves over the have-nots. You are shutting out millions of people, either from a home of their own or from an affordable place to rent, and that can't carry on.
And that sounds like quite a good rehearsal of what the potential sort of message could be from any centre-right party, or any party indeed that is willing to tackle this. Do you think voters are coming around to that sort of thing, or do you think they will still be NIMBY at heart?
Well, I think people on this will take a lead from their political leaders to some degree, right? If every development is presented as a threat, and if every, not just home building scheme, but job creation opportunity in any area in the sort of wider proximity of any of our towns and cities is immediately castigated as a problem, then people will start to adopt an NIMBY mindset. Conversely, if political leaders are brave enough to explain that actually this is the right thing, for your children, your grandchildren, and your community, I think a lot of people will change their approach. And, it wasn't the case that, during the sort of, the great building eras of the 1950s or the 1980s, or even going back pre-war to the 1920s and 30s, there wasn't a reflexive opposition to this stuff. Clearly, there will always be developments which are genuinely unsuitable and should be opposed, and we should be heedful of those voices. But a lot of the time, reflexive NIMBYism is a habit we've acquired. It's a habit we can unacquire if we challenge back. But it will take a degree of courage from elected leaders. It will take some pushback also from members of the public. It would be good, frankly, to have people going to planning meetings and speaking up for a proposed development. It would be good to have Conservative Party members challenging Conservative candidates and MPs on why they aren't getting behind development, rather than just, frankly, encouraging them to go the other way. But I do see stuff on social media from some Conservative MPs, which makes me want to weep, frankly, when it comes to the mad short-sightedness that they are developing and displaying, and the way they are worshipping such false gods when it comes to trying to out-Lib Dem the Lib Dems, which you cannot do, and as good free market conservatives ought never to try to do.
Now, I don't want to get too far down the political rabbit hole because this is a policy podcast, not a political one, but I think it's an interesting public choice question, which is, to the Conservatives, how optimistic are you that they will be able to be not short-sighted when their sort of political situation at the moment is a dilemma? Is it not easy to cling for the low-hanging fruit of the NIMBY vote?
Well, I agree that when you're in a difficult place, that is the temptation. But I've been really encouraged, actually, over the course of the last few weeks about the way the party's message has started to evolve. So we at Onward are the party's partners on the development of housing policy. We've got a very good relationship with leader of the opposition, and I think what Kemi and James Cleverly have done in the videos that they've released shortly before the current parliamentary recess is set a new tone. It's actually talking in terms of aspiration. It's talking in terms of having somewhere decent to raise a family. It's talking in terms of, exactly as we've discussed, densifying in cities, but also not having an absolute block on development in every green field. And that is a sensible, nuanced position, which actually isn't pandering to NIMBYism. I think it's actually quite risk-on in a good way. And it's in stark contrast to all the other political parties, other than Labour, who are, at the moment, talking a good game, but starting to disappoint in terms of the substance. I think industry is noticing.
So to move on a bit more broadly, so the planning problem is key for home ownership and for many other things as well. The broader problem we have is an economic growth one.
Yeah. So
what is give you the floor? What do you think are the biggest barriers to economic growth, and how do we overcome those?
Well, the UK's problems are pretty profound. I mean, fundamentally, the state is spending too much. There are many challenges to growth, and we've obviously we just touched on the supply side challenges around housing. But I think that the most fundamental drag is that the state is too large, and we have not achieved a post-COVID reset in the way that we ought to have done. That is in one way an understandable hangover, but the inertia of the last years of the Conservative government has been replaced by a deliberate attempt to sort of cement in a bigger state now under Labour. There is no sense now that state spending can be cut. We saw in the welfare reforms attempted earlier this year that even when the government tries to do sensible things, not to actually reduce spending, but just to reduce the increase in spending, Labour backbenchers will stop that from happening. And I think that is a massive problem because this millstone around the economy's neck is just going to keep weighing heavier and heavier as the Parliament wears on, and we are now talking about somewhere in the region of 200 billion of extra borrowing over the course of the 25 to 29 Parliament than was anticipated under the legacy Conservative plans. I mean, there is also an enterprise issue in the UK economy, and there is a sickness in British society whereby wealth creation is suddenly something which has gone from being, absolutely regarded as a good normative thing under successive governments, including, ironically, New Labour, to being regarded with suspicion and even hostility by many people. And we don't have a tax regime which supports enterprise. We don't have a popular culture which supports the risk takers and the entrepreneurs, and is frankly heedless of the real terms trade-offs between different parts of public policy and the resultant impact on growth. So I think all of that has created a very unhealthy atmosphere. It feels to me as though fundamentally what the UK needs more than anything else is a reset of culture, and that's hard to do. But it is also the case that opposition is perhaps an easier place in which to develop such the policies which would allow such a reset than government is. I mean, you have served in government and you've seen, the pressure of events. If we can make any good out of this period in the wilderness, it should be that the Conservative Party and the centre-right more generally is creative when it comes to developing a suite of policies which would allow something to change in this country rather than just to continue where it feels, successive governments have taken us.
Because those problems, the cultural problem and the sort of economic problem, if you like, of too much spending and the sort of the demonisation of the wealth creators sort of beget each other, don't they?
Yeah.
Because you spend more, you can't cut the spending anyway, so you have to tax more, and therefore you go to the wealth creators to make that tax.
Yeah.
And that harms the growth, which means you have to keep spending more.
Yeah. The doom loop is real, and like all of these loops, as it ratchets round, it risks becoming faster and more violent, and the snapback effect may even manifest itself as soon as this autumn. But I think if we carry on down this path, it is a matter of time until the UK has a major fiscal crisis, and that may come in November if the Chancellor can't assuage the market's concerns, but it may come due to some external event which just suddenly exposes that the Emperor has no clothes. It is just not okay for the UK to be on the trajectory it's on. The markets know that. The UK is paying a significant risk premium relative to all our G7 peers now, and that is because we are just carrying more exposure to bond markets than anyone wants.
Do you think there is a fundamental problem of dishonesty from politicians of all stripes to really face up to the sort of trade-offs that are needed to manage this situation?
Well, I think this takes us to another level of problem. So we talked about supply-side challenges, and we talked about the anti-wealth creation mindset of the country, but there is a demographic crisis which underpins some of the structural problems of the UK economy. And of course, demography is a really difficult thing to discuss with voters because it leads to all sorts of tricky conversations around, the sustainability of the state pension scheme as it's currently constructed, the triple lock in particular, the sustainability of universal welfare, the sustainability of an NHS where productivity declines while the costs rise. These are really unpopular things to touch, but there is, if not a dishonesty, then a lack of resolve, I think, about how important it is that these things are tackled, because it is only by tackling these things in a coordinated way, which is communicated to the public, that I think you can actually start to get buy-in to why things need to change. So when Rachel Reeves embarked on her withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance from all but a minority of pensioners, she couldn't win that argument because she didn't prosecute it in any kind of, if you like, systemic way. If you attempt individual measures without really establishing the legitimacy of why, then you'll get picked off time after time by lobby groups, frankly. The politics of it will never work. We have to get into a mindset where we are able to explain the balance here between people's interests and those of other parts of society, and the reciprocity which ought to characterise relationships between the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the urban and the rural, in a way which just no one's doing. And it's that seriousness of reform which is going to be required if we're to make the UK a country which can succeed again, which incidentally I'm absolutely convinced that we can. I am not in the doomsday category here. I think that fundamentally I'm always surprised at how resilient the UK is, given all the different challenges that we've loaded on it. But we do need to have a braver conversation and a franker conversation, because the public are not stupid, but often they are simply unaware of the extent to which things which are regarded as normative or sacred cows are in fact deeply, deeply unsustainable.
So that's an interesting question that we've discussed a few times over on this podcast. At what level on this sort of optimism scale are you about the UK? Are you so you're maybe not a doomster, but in terms of how bad things are now, there's lots of talk. You listen to some voices online and elsewhere that think that we are weeks away from civil unrest, that the bond markets are gonna string us up, and that it's going to be defaulting on debts is going to be chaos very quickly, to actually things are going to keep trundling on for quite a while because people are basically happy enough, and if as long as they keep getting their pension go up and etc. then we'll roll on for a bit. Whereabouts do you sit on that?
Well, I think a lot depends on what the Chancellor does in the budget in terms of how sustainable this is. I think if she tries to do a series of incremental measures which are only really try and put sticky tape over the gaping holes in her plans, I think there is quite a high risk, actually, that the bond markets will buck. So, there is a contingent scenario here of being a 2 or 3 in terms of out of 10 in terms of confidence in the country's immediate future. There is also a scenario where she is just braver, bites the bullet, and either does as she ought to do and cut spending, which would be absolutely the right thing, or she could raise taxes. Now, that would be anathema to me, and I suspect to most of the viewers of this programme, but it would at least give the markets confidence that we're going to do a much better job of balancing the books than we currently are. There is the inconvenient truth, of course, that would break her manifesto commitments, unwisely made, but because in order to achieve the kind of structural reset of the public finances which would give the markets confidence, you need to go for the broad-based taxes to achieve, the kind of income that is required to meet a sort of 40-50 billion pound black hole. And good luck, as they say, with that, because it would be ugly. The UK, is already at a post-war high in terms of taxation. The last thing we need is to tax more. But I do think that route, whilst unadvisable, would at least stave off the risk of an immediate crisis and probably push it a little further down the line. So I suppose probably I am genuinely waiting for the budget in a spirit of let's see, because but I would certainly want to underscore, I think the downside risk if she gets this wrong is very high.
So you were Chief Secretary
of
Treasury. You spoke about the importance of spending cuts. So if you were in that seat now, what would you be drawing a red line for it?
Well, I mean, all departments have a degree of waste, and that is, I'm afraid, the grim reality of government. I think in some cases there is a sort of massive optimism bias and efficiency problem, and I'd single out the Department of Health and the MOD as particularly serious culprits. When I was Chief Secretary, the number of exceptional requests that came through from both of those was unacceptably high, and it wasn't just because it was in the backdrop of the COVID era. There was a lot of problems with the management of both departments. But the real problem with the UK public finances is welfare. That is where the real unacceptable face of a bloated state is found, not least obviously because if people are parked on welfare, it's hurting their life chances, it's diminishing our economic growth potential. So it comes with a sort of a cost which goes beyond just that to the immediately to the exchequer. It is not okay for so many people to be written off in the way that they are, and we're now in a situation where there are 1.2 million more people on health-related benefits than there were in February 2020. There is simply no way that over 1 million people have become too sick to work in the last 5 years of working age. That is a problem, which we can trace back, in good faith to what happened during the pandemic. The checks on UC were relaxed. We can argue whether that was the right decision or not, but they certainly ought to have been restored very robustly, long before now. And of course, we've seen that the government has done that challenge, and the plans that they inherited from the Sunak government have been torn up. And I'm afraid we are back to what Fraser Nelson used to call the most expensive poverty in the world. We are now just accepting that all of these people are long term, to be carried on the backs of others, and it's a terrible outcome for literally everyone, and arguably most particularly those people who do end up just living as welfare recipients, and all of the massive social consequences we know flow from that.
Are there changes that you wish you had made when you were in Treasury?
I wish that we hadn't carried on with the exceptional COVID support for as long as we did. I think that is probably my big regret. I mean, I can't say that I was advocating for that at the time, right? At the time, the pressure from the scientific establishment, from Whitty and Valence, and and incidentally the opposition and large parts of the media and the public was, keep going for as long as possible with an absolutely maximalist response, regardless of the trade-offs. Looking back, I do think that the extent of lockdown was a mistake. It's not. God, I mean, it's not an unqualified thing to say, because I do believe some measure of lockdown was required, actually, particularly in the spring of 2020, when we just didn't really know what we were dealing with, when the rate of spread was very high, when the lethality of the virus probably was higher. That I think was the right decision. But as vaccination was rolled out, I think we ought to have probably wound down the measures early, and that would have saved a great deal of money. Beyond that, really, my tenure as Chief Secretary was so shaped by that response. It's very difficult to think of other things that you could realistically have done. I mean, I obviously asked myself this quite a lot, but I was there for a year. It bracketed the back half of COVID and then the first bit of the Ukraine war, and it was not a time when, if you like, structural focus on the efficiency of the state was something which we had the capacity to do.
You've now mentioned structural reform, which is something I want to talk a bit about, because you've obviously been in multiple roles in government and thought about these things and how to work within the system. And some of the reforms we've spoken about today already have been quite radical on supply side reform and on welfare reform. So how confident are you that those things are deliverable within the system? And by the system, I sort of mean in the biggest sense, both the civil service, but also the laws, etc., that surround our political system and government. How can they be delivered, and what changes would need to be made, do you think, to sort of deliver the economic dynamism that we'd want to see?
Yeah, I do think there are some problems within the civil service. I don't think they're as grave as some do, actually, probably. I think it is fundamentally a question of direction and of setting the right culture. But I didn't find, actually, in any in either of the departments in which I worked, that there was any pushback from the civil service. Actually, quite the opposite. I think they were very on board. Whether I would say that had I been a Home Office minister is a different question. I do think there are some departments where you wouldn't be able to say that with such confidence. I'm sure there are many good people, there, but you could not say that there was an unqualified enthusiasm for getting behind the government's work to, for example, stop small boats. That doesn't seem, I'm afraid, an accurate reflection. On the courts, yes, again, I think there is a problem. Fundamentally, the next Conservative government is going to have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think that's what will be announced at Conservative Party conference in October, and thank God for that. That's something I've pushed for a long time. It's crazy that the ramifications across all aspects of public policy are enormous, because in essence, a judicial class has been given huge amounts of power to shape the law according to their whims and the pressures exerted on them by various lobby groups, and it's that is mad and can only be curbed by fundamentally resetting our human rights settlement.
Could you actually just give us, because we haven't dived into this topic a lot on this podcast, could you give us a bit of a rundown of the case for leaving the UCHR?
Well, I think the base case is that what was a response, and a legitimate response, to the horrors of World War II has been twisted out of shape by the doctrine that the Convention is a living instrument, quote unquote, which has progressively seen the definition of what constitutes human rights massively widened to include what ought properly to be characterised as social rights. So it's allowed huge mission creep in terms of those things which ought to be accommodated, some of which are, if you like, gratuitously offensive to good sense. For example, the rights of prisoners, but others of which have underpinned some of the very issues that have, for example, led to this ballooning problem with our inability to police our own borders. And Article 3, the right to life, and Article 8, the right to family life, have more or less closed down our ability to remove people who have no legal right to be in this country. But it spills over beyond that. I mean, even some of the planning debate that we touched on at the outset is predicated on issues relating to human rights. So it is a mad situation where this convention has become such a problem in our society, and it's not the case that leaving a convention means resigning from the UK having a very, very high standard of human rights protections. You know, we are the country of Magna Carta. The common law of the land is incredibly strong, and there will be a variety of options open to us in a post-ECHR world to affirm the core rights which we all believe in. Whether that ought to be in a new British Bill of Rights is something which I think ought to be considered very carefully, because I'm not certain that's a slam dunk way to do it. But you know, that's a legitimate and important conversation for us to have as part of this ongoing debate. But what I would say is, you know, you look at Australia, you look at Canada, you look at New Zealand, you know, you look at the United States, and all of them managed to be strong, vibrant democracies without being members of the ECHR. And I do think we had to be very careful to distinguish, you know, the mindset of Churchill and Attlee in the immediate aftermath of 1945 to what it has become today.
Mm-hmm. So what are the structural reforms? So talking about a bit of civil service reform, leaving the ECHR, are those the sort of things in your head as you need to fix those problems?
Well, I think they're very important. I mean, you can't delay the other stuff. You have to all be done in tandem. You know, yes, you know, they are both critical to getting, if you like, the engine of the state to have a transmission mechanism which ministers can reliably pull. I mean, too often it felt like you were either pulling a lever that came off in your hand or was just not connected to anything. So restoring the ability of Britain to govern herself is all in that basket. And of course, you know, here you touch on the tailwinds of the Brexit debate as well, right? What was that if not a vote to make sure that, you know, the people in you know, Whitehall actually are governing this country and are accountable to the people of this country for their performance. But yeah, there are many broader questions than this. You cannot simply say that fixing the tools of government is enough. You actually have to fix the ideas, and I do think that, you know, a major reset a la 1979 is required to actually give us a reason to govern. Simply governing in second gear, to continue the motoring analogy, won't be enough. We have got to achieve a higher level of performance, and that does mean confronting demographics, it does mean confronting popular attitudes to wealth creation, and it does mean, above all, curbing state spending. And those are questions of policy creation and then of policy communication, of winning an argument that the country can and should be better than this. The country can and should be more prosperous than this. And that if it were, of course, more prosperous, it would make so many of our choices here so much easier. If we just had the trend growth rate of the period prior to 2008, so many of the horrible choices that Whitehall is always wrestling with would at least diminish, and in some cases probably cease to exist entirely.
So what top three things, and sorry to be reductive, that's quite a good way of distilling your thoughts, would you do to get back to that trend growth rate?
Well, I think I do think the housing fix is massive. So roughly speaking, 100,000 homes is 1% added to GDP. So, you know, that's big. That's, you know, macroeconomically big. And I think, you know, a big drive on that would have huge implications for social mobility as well. So that would be right up there. Curbing state spending would be the second. I think we have to look at, as I say, not only the incapacity and sickness-related benefits bill, but I would scrap the triple lock on pensions. I think it was addressing a falling behind in terms of the relative value of pensions compared to you know, people in work's earnings. That gap has not just been closed; it's now probably out of kilter the other way. And I would look at replacing the triple lock with having a link to the average increase in earnings in a given year. That feels to me to be a fair and much more sustainable benchmark. Which
but politically difficult, right?
Politically difficult, but fundamentally, what is the point of being in government if you are making things less sustainable? And even more so, what is the point of being in opposition if you're not prepared to develop, as I say, a proper, balanced, reciprocal offer to the country which would make people's lives better? It is high time that we confronted that. And then I think the third, well, you could characterise it, I'm going to do a typical politician as I want to have four, but I do think you need a push on tax, right? You've got to make sure that the economy is more dynamic. And so I would be looking to lower the burden of tax, which would be the flip side, frankly, of reducing spending.
Where would you go first? Which tax?
Where would I go? Well, I think the national insurance increase that the Chancellor delivered last autumn would be my first port of call. That is obviously hurting employment, is obviously hurting employment rather in the starter jobs category. If you look at the fall in unemployment we've seen in this Parliament, it's concentrated primarily in the 20 to 35-year-old age category. That is precisely the group of people you do not want to be struggling to get into the workforce. So I would go there first. But I would also like to start to bring down corporation tax again after the increase we saw in the last Parliament. And I would like to unfreeze the thresholds for income tax. I think people need to be incentivised, to actually keep more of what they earn. And then, yes, the fourth thing would be a regulatory reset as well to try and make sure that because it's not just a tax question, right? It's also it's the ungumming up of Britain, which embraces a lot of things. Embraces some of the stuff we talked about around planning, but it also embraces things like making it a success of Brexit and how you get the city to be competitive again in a way which it has ceased to be in recent years. And some of that is about pressing on where Jeremy Hunt left off with the Edinburgh reforms, for example, trying to establish competitive advantage. Likewise in life sciences, in agri-tech, all of these sectors where we could and should be embracing the opportunities of divergence. This government is wedded to maximum convergence with Europe. I would argue precisely the opposite is true. What is the point of our current policy situation, if not to embrace the fact that we have so many of the trade links which we do enjoy, but also the freedom to innovate?
So if we get these things right, then you're optimistic about Britain?
Fundamentally, yes. I mean, this is. I do think that this country remains an amazing place. I do think the majority of people don't think of Britain as a sort of sick country in society, because actually, for most of the country, things are okay, but they are just gradually bumping down at the moment. But get these things right, get the economy more dynamic, get the welfare state operating on a more sustainable way, embrace the latent opportunities of the economy and get it ticking along at a higher rate. And actually, things can look pretty good. And certainly by comparison to an increasingly sclerotic Eurozone, I think we have a fantastic opportunity to kick on. And you look at the underlying growth rate of the United States, and it is a very different economy, but it does show that Western societies can succeed, but you do actually have to will it so. You can't just expect it to happen. And I think my great caution to everyone in Britain in 2025 would be we shouldn't just assume that we are a wealthy country as of right. We have to actually do the things that make it possible to succeed. But if you do, as we saw so spectacularly throughout the 1980s, then you can achieve remarkable things and everyone can benefit.
Do you think that's what went wrong in this sort of 2010 to 2024 period? What do you think it could be boiled down to? Those sort of expecting us to be okay because we were the UK and not enough?
Well, I think I mean we were dealt a bloody awful hand in that period. You had a series of crises. Obviously you inherited the mess of Labour's blow up in 08 to 10. Then you bumped very hard into the challenges of Parliament attempting to frustrate Brexit and the prolonged period of uncertainty that flowed from that. Then you encounter COVID, and then you encounter war in Ukraine. So I will always contextualise that period of government by saying that it was the worst in terms of external events since the war. But yes, I think Cameron Osborne, who did a lot of good in terms of starting to bring state spending down, didn't make the moral case for a smaller state. It was done in an apologetic way. We're sorry we're having to cut this spending, rather than actually this is healthy and good, and we're focused on efficiency and better outcomes. I think that was a missed opportunity. And then I think the back half of our time in government was just so fantastically challenging that achieving coherence simply wasn't really attainable. But do I think that the economic legacy of those 14 years is very mixed? Yeah, yes, I do. And we're paying a price for that now. But the only way to get out of this situation that the centre right now finds itself in is to show that we've learned the lessons. In the same way, I think that the party in the mid-1970s showed that it understood that it had moved on from Heathism. This is what we need to, I do sort of, the public are there to be persuaded if we show that we genuinely get it. All of these reform types who sort of throw things at Conservatives saying, well, why didn't you, you've never been trusted again, right? Well, in the same way that Mrs. Thatcher was Ted Heath's education secretary, she got it big time, changed her party, changed her policy platform, and won again. And we have to embark on a comparable journey, which shows that we understand why people are so furious, but also that there is another and a better face of conservatism.
I think that is a good place to leave it. Simon, thank you very much for joining us.
Great pleasure.
Thank you too for tuning in. We'll be back on Friday with our usual weekly podcast. Until then, you can find all of our work at insider.iea.org.uk. Thank you very much.